Hello, everybody. I'm Dr. Brad Musil, and welcome to episode 2 of Book Musings. In this episode, I'll be taking a look at Why We Sleep, Unlocking the Power of Sleep and Dreams by Matthew Walker, PhD. I alluded to this book at the end of episode 1, mentioning that it might be the next one of the next ones I tackle, and sure enough, I did finish it actually yesterday. A little bit about how it is I came upon this book. I think I mentioned this as well in the last episode, but was listening to Joe Rogan podcast, which I like to listen to every now and then, not quite as much as I used to, but was listening to the Joe Rogan podcast and happened to come across the episode that featured Matthew Walker. And by the way, there's a picture of Matthew for us here. Before I forget, I'll mention that he is a professor of neuroscience and psychology at UC Berkeley, the director of the Center for Human Sleep Science, and a former professor of psychiatry at Harvard University. And I believe it says somewhere, he got his degree overseas as well, I think at Cambridge. Obvious from the get-go, as was clear. I mentioned the Joe Rogan podcast, as was clear in that podcast. The guy knows what he's talking about. Very, well-versed in everything to do with sleep. And so in terms of my background and coming to this book, well, I've always been fascinated by sleep, as I think most of us probably, are at some point. We wonder about what is sleep, why do we spend so much of our existence in this state of sleep? If you think about it, it's, 30, 50%, I don't know what it is ultimately, but it's a long time. And I'll allude to this later, sort of my conceptions of sleep coming into reading this book, and then my conceptions of sleep now. But I always so I'll elaborate on this later, but I always used to think of it as like kind of not existing in a sense. So we spend so much of our time, in our life not existing, if you will, right? If you think of it as I used to, at least in terms of kind of not existing, right? You're not awake to this reality. In some sense, you're not here. And yet we spend so much of our existence not being here in such a way. And so I've always been drawn to this, this thing called sleep. And so, he seemed like a fascinating, intelligent guy. It was a no-brainer then. I wanted to, hear more about what he had to say. And so, I picked this up again. I've always been interested in sleep, everything to do with sleep myself, yawning, for example. What explains its seeming, its contagious nature. And I think, I don't remember him actually touching upon that specific thing, but I think the research has borne out that it does seem to be contagious. So what is behind that? There's so many mysterious things about sleep. And so I was eager then to dive into what he has to say about sleep and all, these related issues. And I will say he does cover the gamut seemingly in terms of the different elements of everything to do with sleep that he touches upon. And that'll come out and here in a moment when I go through and kind of outline the book itself and what he's up to in the 4 different parts of the book. He really does offer us a nice survey, not only of all the issues related to sleep, but then almost as importantly for me anyway, all the related research then and what it's telling us. That was actually one of the things I took most away from reading this book, was just all the fascinating research that he alludes to. And of course, he is a researcher himself, so he's immersed in a lot of the research he's citing. And he'll mention the experiments he himself. I don't know why I kind of pointed myself when I did that, but the research he himself is involved in, and it's quite a bit. And then but he doesn't stop there. He references all sorts of different research and all kinds of different fascinating experiments, not just contemporary, but going as far back as sleep research goes. So I'll tell you what I think towards the end of the episode, and it'll kind of come out as we proceed, but he's very thorough. Let me say that at the outset. Very thorough. Now, is the book very engaging? Is it accessible? I'll say more about that as we proceed, but definitely knows his stuff and is definitely very thorough in how he proceeds. So I bought the book right after I heard him on the podcast. I looked it up. It was about 3 months ago I bought the book. I started reading it, I think, right away. Really the last month or so I really pushed through and finished it. As I think I suggested in the previous episode, I'm usually reading a few different books at a time, and so I don't necessarily just focus on the one and plow through it, but Especially lately, though, I've really been focusing on this and really been letting it soak in. And one of the things that'll become clear as we proceed is that, it really has been a life-changing book on par with, for me anyway, on par with another one. And I'll say more about this one as well as we proceed. But um, I guess that's kind of a preview of where we're going and kind of the takeaways I had from the book. Pretty substantial. But anyway, let's go ahead and dive in then. What is the book actually about? It was published, it's relatively recent. It was published in 2017. And as I intimated, it essentially offers a survey of everything to do with sleep. What is it? Why do we need it? The different aspects of it. How we're affected when we don't get it. Of course, then also in part 4, he sort of articulates his own suggestions in terms of how we can improve on an individual level, societal level, and so on. So he's really doing a lot of things in the book, and he does a good job of, again, touching on all these aspects, and then not only doing that, but then, representing what the research suggests regarding all these different issues as well. So there are these 4 parts, as I alluded to the book, and I think the best way to kind of proceed in terms of giving you an idea what the book's about is just to kind of go through each of these parts in turn and kind of talk about what he's up to in those parts. And I'm going to be drawing a lot from the book, and I think it'll give you a good taste of how the book delivers its message. And there's a lot of good stuff in here. And so again, I think by offering you some taste, then you'll get an idea of what it's like to read the book. It really is, I think, ultimately going to be worth your time, probably, if for no other reason, as he reiterates, just given how important sleep, the science suggests how important sleep is. But anyway, so I'll try to give you a taste for what the book's like, and then the idea being hopefully you will actually go out and, if not his book, at least go investigate sleep further, at least more than I did before I picked this one up. So part 1 is called This Thing Called Sleep. It essentially covers what sleep is, and it's very extensive. It was one of the better parts in my opinion. I guess I liked all the first 3 parts quite a bit, and I guess the one takeaway would be that part 4, and I'll mention this in my criticisms, is the part I liked least, I guess. All the other 3 parts I really dug, if you will, and really got into. So this part, he's again outlining the very nature of sleep, what it is, the different processes involved, really. The fact, he'll articulate the fact that every known species sleeps, and how it seems important for every known species. Speaking of that, actually, let me start there. Page 56 here. With page 56 from the book, he comes out and says, quote, "Without exception, every animal species studied to date sleeps," end quote. So this is a pervasive phenomenon. Okay. Now, he does point out pretty early on in the book that while every species sleeps, the way we sleep, and this is kind of fascinating, different species, the way they sleep, the amount of sleep they need, all of that can vary quite significantly, actually. But every species is the same in the sense that we all need sleep. Okay, but he does again reference, for example, he says on page 58, quote, "Total amount of time is one of the most conspicuous differences in how organisms sleep," end quote. And he goes on to talk about how some organisms need a lot of sleep. Conversely, like humans, we don't, relatively speaking, we don't seem to need as much in terms of total time. Conversely, though, we tend to have our sleep saturated with REM sleep. More on this in a moment. So lots of different. It's interesting the character. There's a profile maybe of each species and how different its sleeping character is. He says, kind of elaborating on the differences. This is also on page 58. He says, quote, "So they're not entirely sure what explains all these differences and these requirements for more or less sleep and so on. But he does say, quote, "The relationship between the size of the nervous system, the complexity of the nervous system, and total body mass appears to be a somewhat meaningful predictor, with increasing brain complexity relative to body size resulting in greater sleep amounts." So again, they're not entirely sure what explains the differences in terms of what we need, but they're there. Granted, every species needs to sleep, and it gets really fascinating. He goes into like, how aquatic species seem to be different in terms of what they need versus non-aquatic species and so on and so forth. And I think one of the things, and this will come out in a moment, but for example, I don't think the aquatic species need REM sleep as much as the non-aquatic species. So very interesting, again, just these general differences in terms of, granted, we all need sleep. What kind of sleep we need and how much sleep we need can vary significantly. So he talks about, lays out, 60, I think, is where I talk about. He talks about how not every species, so every species needs sleep, but not every species seems to need REM sleep. So he says, this is on page 60, quote, however, insects, amphibians, fish, and most reptiles show no clear signs of REM sleep. So they don't seem to need it, and they don't show any demonstrable signs of it, at least not yet. Now if I recall correctly, he thinks that, now he says that his colleagues would disagree, but he thinks that we probably just haven't sensed it yet, or we don't have the capacity to detect it as we do with non-aquatic species, for example. So he speculates, but as of right now, they don't seem to have as much, at least, REM sleep or the need for it, and they don't seem to demonstrate it. So I thought that was interesting. But a lot of us are familiar in general with this notion that we have sort of, as we sleep, if we have a healthy amount of sleep throughout the night, we have these 5 complete cycles, right? And so he talks about that, outlines that. I think he does a good job. I didn't necessarily know a lot of this stuff. It kind of, I guess, refreshed my memory of it. I knew it back in the day, so to speak. But he gives a nice, he's always given graphs and charts. But here we have, again, this depiction of these 5 cycles, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, throughout a healthy night of sleep. And we start awake, right? And what's interesting is we immediately then go into this REM stage before then going into deeper stages of the NREM sleep, which he then points out is, so NREM, non-REM sleep, is further classified into these 4 stages, which is just called stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4, which are only differentiated by how hard it is ultimately to wake the person up from sleep. I believe literally that's what I read him saying, was that's the only differentiating feature between those 4 stages of NREM sleep. But anyway, so you go through, right? In each of these cycles, I guess what was interesting to me, they're like U's, right? And we begin and end actually in REM, right? And then we get in those deep stages. And so then we go back to REM, and we don't quite wake up, right? We go back into the deeper stages. Come back, a little lighter sleep, start dreaming, don't quite wake up, keep dreaming, start to go back in the deeper stages, and so on and so forth. 5 times, for whatever reason, that's how it is for us. That's how we're constructed. And then on that 5th time, the light, it goes into the physiological nature of it, right? The chemicals involved and so on. But the gate that was closed to the external perceptions throughout our sleep, right, that opens up, and upon that, if we're sleeping in a healthy fashion, upon that 5th cycle with daylight, ideally, right, it'll release, and then we actually wake up then and start perceiving the external world. So there are these 2 main factors he talks about, the circadian rhythm, which most of us are familiar with, but then there's also this sleep pressure chemical called adenosine, adenosine. So most of us, and myself, familiar with the circadian rhythm, right? Sort of biological sense of time that we have that regulates our sleep. But we also have then this chemical that builds up within us that he refers to as the sleep pressure chemical, right? Where that's also working on us. And so at a certain point, that'll become too overwhelming, right? We can't resist the urge anymore to stay to fall asleep. And so these 2 different factors are really what's ultimately governing our wakefulness and sleeping states, right? So another theme that comes out in the book that I thought was kind of interesting is that REM, so like when we're dreaming, and then our waking states are very similar in terms of our brain waves. And so physiologically, what's going on, it seems very similar, like when they measure our brain waves. So page 47 here, he shows, what the brain waves look like, okay, when we're awake. So that would be the top one, right? And then when we're in the deep stages of NREM sleep versus, our REM dreaming state. It's very similar. The REM state is, when we're dreaming, is very similar to the awake state. Okay, now there are some differences, and again, our body, as one of the things he talks about, right, is our brain paralyzes our body, except for whatever reason, our eyes can still move. Okay, but that's different, obviously. When we're awake, we're not paralyzed. We don't paralyze ourselves, and it's for good reason, though. He gets into that, why it is that our brain paralyzes our body when we're sleeping, because we don't want to act out, right, and start, we're dreaming of things coming at us. We don't start flailing our limbs and break bones in reality, so to speak, right? So there are some differences going on. But in terms of brain activity and brain waves, ultimately, right, like they're very similar, and so I thought that was interesting. What do I have here in 52? Oh, so furthering kind of the similarity there. So he says on page 52, quote, REM sleep brain activity is an almost perfect replica of that seen during attentive, alert wakefulness, end quote. Now he does say what's interesting, and this kind of comes out actually in some fascinating research that I'll allude to later, where we seem actually smarter when we're dreaming. It's bizarre. But he does point out then later on page 52, quote, there are individual parts of the brain that are up to 30% more active during REM sleep than when we are awake, end quote. So not only is it like as active, our brain, and like as moving as rapidly, but it's arguably more awake, I almost said, more active than it is when we're awake. So that just boggles my mind, and probably will boggle my mind even more when I'm sleeping tonight. Just very fascinating stuff there, if you ask me. So he gets into a little bit like, what the differences are. Then we know we have these different stages, or these two distinct types of sleep, NREM and REM sleep, and most of us were probably familiar with that. And he does a nice job, I think, of articulating then what's going on and what the science bears out in terms of what's going on in each of these two general types of sleep, right? NREM versus REM. So the idea with NREM sleep is that it's essentially like solidifying any of the new information we garnered throughout our daily existence, right? It's trying to solidify that and make it sort of more permanent or permanently accessible if it's important, that is. So that's that element of our sleep is important for learning and ingraining whatever we learn in our everyday experience. So he says of NREM sleep, quote, what you are actually experiencing, and this is from page 50, during deep NREM sleep is one of the most epic displays of neural collaboration that we know of, end quote. So there's a lot going on, and it, again, the general idea is that we are solidifying and making it more firm what we've come to learn in our, that day, in our wakeful experience during that day. I thought it was interesting. It kind of compares what's going on in our deep sleep NREM stage with like AM versus FM radio waves. So like FM radio waves are much, they're what's the word? Wavelength is much shorter, right? And they're much more frequent. And they have their advantages, right? They're much more powerful in their bursts, but then they can't sustain long distances, though, right? That's the advantage of the longer AM waves. And he says the exact same thing seems to seems to be the case with respect to what's going on in our deep NREM sleep. Remember, the waves for that were these long, elongated waves. And what seems to be going on then is, he says, it's basically like the science is suggesting we are parts of our brain that don't typically communicate right, are actually in communication, given the ability of these longer waves to it enables them to communicate, whereas during our typical wakefulness, they're not able to communicate. And so that comes out actually, probably come out much clearer in the quotes here that I have. So he says, quote, as your brain shifts from the fast frequency activity of waking to the slower, more measured pattern of deep NREM sleep, the very same long-range communication advantage becomes possible, end quote. That was from page 51. And then following that, on page 52, so actually just going along, the steady, slow, synchronous waves that sweep across the brain during deep sleep open up communication possibilities between distant regions of the brain, allowing them to collaboratively send and receive their different repositories of stored experience, end quote. Page 50, so that was pages 51 to 52. So when we're in that deep state of sleep, that NREM state of sleep, where we have those long brain waves, again, the idea is we're conveying, transferring, and this comes out too, memories from short-term to long-term spots in our brain, if you will, parts of our brain. I'll say more about that in a little bit. So REM sleep, and this is interesting for me to learn more about too, is what it gives us or offers us. So both of these, NREM and REM are vital for us. We need them both. It kind of gets into, well, which one's more important? Well, we need them both. They're equally important in some sense, in that we're going to suffer if we don't have them. But they do serve different purposes. So again, NREM is solidifying new knowledge, if you will, new experiences, and permanently more making sure that the ones that are important that we care about are more permanently ingrained in us then. And then REM, though, is like, it's all about creativity and discovering different ways of approaching things and solving things, problem solving. It's what enables us to make more insightful connections that we otherwise wouldn't have been able to make. And he offers these fascinating examples, historical examples of, people for whom, dreaming offered, a solution to a problem they otherwise couldn't seem to solve. So more on that in a moment. Page 76. So this is again page 76. He speaks to like the nature of REM sleep. He says, for example, quote, we can awake the next morning with new solutions to previously intractable problems, or even be infused with radically new and original ideas, end quote. And he will cite, several examples of that. So part 3 of the book is basically dives into REM sleep and dreaming, and elaborates on all the fascinating elements of that. And he speaks more than to the creative nature of REM sleep in that part. Okay. I like his summary. So I mentioned actually while I'm talking about the REM sleep stage, it's important to note again that our brain, fascinating, does paralyze the rest of our body, right? That's why we don't break bones as we're having these very, 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 very vivid dreams. One thing that, I don't know that he speaks to this either, and I could be wrong, and I don't remember everything in this book, but one kind of question I had is, why, again, does it not paralyze our eye movements, though? And that's why, REM, rapid eye movement, that is how it kind of came to be known, right? That there was this distinct sort of element of our sleep where we were doing something different, right? Dreaming. Why is it that the eye movement is still allowed, though? Right? Why does our brain paralyze everything else but that? And what's interesting is, and I'll say more about this later in the episode, but that thankfully, I guess in some sense, our brain doesn't shut down our eye movement, because that's what allowed researchers to provide objective evidence, as Matthew Walker puts it, that lucid dreaming is possible, which is the subject of one of my favorite movies of all time, Waking Life. Right, this notion that we can control our dreams. He says there's evidence of that, and again, I'll speak to that more later. In part because, again, not everything about our body is completely paralyzed during dreams, right? At least not our eye movement. So he offers a nice summary on page 53 of these three kind of brain states, right? So like wakefulness versus NREM versus REM, right? How our brain is kind of different in all these three different stages. So again, this page comes from page 53 of the book. He says, when it comes to information processing, think of the wake state principally as reception, experiencing and constantly learning the world around you. NREM sleep as reflection, storing and strengthening those raw ingredients of new facts and skills. And REM sleep as integration, interconnecting those raw ingredients with each other, with all past experiences, and in doing so, building an ever more accurate model of how the world works, including innovative insights and problem-solving abilities, end quote. So again, I thought that was kind of a nice summary of what our brain seems to be up to in all three of these distinct phases of our existence. One thing he also starts talking about in part one that he builds on throughout the rest of the book, as evidenced by the quotes I'll have here, is this idea that you can't get back what you've lost in terms of sleep. So like, a lot of us are under the impression that, we work our butts off during the week, we don't get as much sleep, or hauling kids around or whatever. Maybe we're students and we're working our butts off during the week, working our jobs and then also studying, et cetera, et cetera. But we'll make up for it on the weekend, right? As I came to call it, as I was kind of preparing for this video, the hibernation method. And my mom actually is a perfect example of, a hibernator, as I would say, right? So growing up, she was a night owl. I too, basically up until reading this book, literally up until reading this book, for as long as I can remember it, have been a night owl as well. Now, I didn't do what my mother did growing up, so, and, including past when I was out of the house, she would still do this. She would get very little sleep during the week. She'd work Monday through Friday or Monday through Thursday and would work a lot of hours during those days and would wake up super early, but she'd still go to sleep super late. So she'd get like 4 hours of sleep or less. And then on the weekends, it was like she hibernated. Like she would sleep hours and hours and hours. But he speaks to that, right? He mentions the research that suggests not good. You can't get it back, right? Whatever you lose in terms of sleep, even just one night, right? One night of insufficient sleep is still bad, and you can't completely regain what you lost, which makes me, I guess at least I read this now, right, and can still, do some good. I just wish I had read a lot earlier and realized, like so many of us probably think, well, you can't get it back, and once you do it the first time, that's already screwing yourself over to the point where you can't, again, completely get it back. So, on that point, he mentions, again, this is a recurring theme throughout the book. Where is it? Okay. It is important, so this is a quote, pages 63 to 64. It is important to note, however, that regardless of the amount of recovery opportunity, the brain never comes close to getting back all the sleep it has lost. And then this is a sentence later, that humans and all other species can never sleep back that which we have previously lost is one of the most important take-homes of this book, the saddening consequences of which I will describe in chapters 7 and 8, end quote. So again, that was quotations from pages 63 and 64. So again, recurring theme, and one that he hopes came out, which it did, Matthew, kudos. I will not be a hibernator, thanks to you, Matthew. I did discover the bad nature of that method, if you will. Page 138, he has a similar, he says something similar, which kind of rejects that hibernation method, if you will. So he says, he refers to, quote, similar to many people's notion of sleeping it off on the weekends to pay off their weeknight sleep debt. However, even after 3 nights of ad-lib recovery sleep, performance did not return to that observed at the original baseline assessment when those same individuals had been getting a full 8 hours of sleep regularly, end quote. You can't get it back. You'll never be as good as if you just got the actual requisite amount every time. Right? So you might feel okay, you think, right? But you'll never feel as okay as you really could have felt. Page 156. Again, Matthew really does want to drive this point home. Mr. Walker, I should say. So this was a kind of interesting study. Again, you can't gain back an initial loss, this speaks to. So, again, this is quoting, I'm going to be quoting pages 156 and 157. He says, quote, the more nights of sleep participants had before they were tested, the better their memory was. Okay, so he's describing the study. All except another subgroup of participants. The difference was that they, so this other group, were deprived of sleep the first night after learning and were not tested the following day. They showed absolutely no evidence of memory consolidation improvement. In other words, if you don't sleep the very first night after learning, you lose the chance to consolidate those memories, even if you get lots of catch-up sleep thereafter. In terms of memory, then, sleep is not like the bank. You cannot accumulate a debt and hope to pay it off at some later point in time, end quote. Okay, so again, very prominent theme throughout the book. You can't get it back. I thought it was interesting. I didn't know about this. You know, some of the stuff I had, it was on my horizon at the very least, but, you know, this notion of monophasic and biphasic sleep patterns. Okay, so sleeping once through a cycle, let's say a 24-hour cycle, or sleeping twice, biphasic, sleeping, you know, having 2 times which you sleep. So we talked about how the latter, biphasic, right, sleeping twice, that's actually more natural for us. And for the longest time, we've done that. And it's only until recently that we've really shifted to sleeping all at once or only one at one time. He talks about how, again, physiologically, the evidence suggests that we're hardwired to take an afternoon nap. You know, this whole idea of siestas, which, you know, in many European countries, I believe, you know, they still have these siestas where sometimes, you know, the shops will shut down for a period in the afternoon. Everyone will take naps. This is how we would naturally work because, again, of the circadian rhythm and the sleep pressure chemical, if left to our own devices, if not affected by ultimately the Industrial Revolution, he suggests, and, you know, all this technology and LED lights and so on, artificial lights. If we weren't affected by all these different factors, we would continue to, most of us anyway, if left to nature, would continue to, again, you know, take these afternoon naps when we feel tired in the afternoon. But it's only because of these sort of societal changes in recent history that we, you know, have changed to just sleeping that one time. And again, he associates it with the more or less to the Industrial Revolution. He says on page 70, the separation from biphasic sleep occurred at or even before our shift from an agrarian existence to an industrial one. Page 70, and he highlights, again, a lot of the sort of processes involved near the Industrial Revolution that then led us to shift from that biphasic to monophasic sleep pattern. So I alluded to this earlier. Humans are unique. So every species sleeps. Of course, humans aren't the only ones that are unique. Again, every species seems to have an interesting profile. Even like birds, it was fascinating to hear him give an account of birds and how they sleep, right? They have like micro sleeps, because they literally, some of them are like, when you see them in a flock flying in a V, like the ones in the middle are a lot of times sleeping for like in their micro sleeps, and then they take turns going to the outside where, you know, they aren't sleeping. I don't remember the specifics, but that's the gist of it. So it's very interesting. They have their own way of sleeping. Humans, again, are unique as well. We tend to sleep less comparatively, right? Our need for, like, let's say 8 hours, that's less than most species, but we dream way more. And so he speaks to this. So let's see, page 72. So he says, quote, the total amount of time we spend asleep is markedly shorter than all other primates. 8 hours relative to the 10 to 15 hours of sleep observed in all other primates, yet we have a disproportionate amount of REM sleep, the stage in which we dream, end quote. And it's interesting to hear him kind of summarize why he thinks we've evolved the way we have too. He talks about that on pages 76 through 77. You know, why is it that again, some of the way we sleep and how much sleep we need in certain regards, why that's changed. So he says, quote, Our shift from tree to ground sleeping instigated an even more bountiful amount of relative REM sleep compared with other primates, and from this bounty emerged a steep increase in cognitive creativity, emotional intelligence, and thus social complexity. So we were able to indulge in this REM sleep that other primates weren't able to, and that then, right, thanks to the beauty of REM and dreaming, right, and that creative capacity and it enables us and fosters, that then gave us a huge advantage. So speaking more to that, he then says, page 77, quote, REM sleep dreaming therefore represents a tenable new contributing factor, among others, that led to our astonishingly rapid evolutionary rise to power, for better and worse, a new sleep-fueled, globally dominant social superclass. Okay. So interesting to hear him sort of describe again how we have changed evolutionarily in an evolutionary sense, regarding what types of sleep we get and how that then gave us an advantage, he thinks, in terms of us versus other primates, you might say. Another kind of theme that comes out and that I've kind of thought a lot about, and it's interesting how this kind of coincides with, I'm also working on The Great Philosophical Abyss, another series I do. This question of like all sorts of related questions, but like, what ultimately are we? Like, what is our personal identity? What are we in essence, at the most basic fundamental level? And it's interesting that, and this is how it's related, that we all have a sense in which, like, when we dream, right, and when we sleep, those are the disjointed points, right? And those are the disruptions from the actual reality of our waking existence. But in some sense, and that's the beauty of this movie as well, there are some who would suggest, and the science seems to suggest, that maybe we have that backwards, right? And that the more rudimentary, primordial, fundamental existence is actually, like sleep, or in some way being asleep, and that really the disjointedness or disruptions then are these fits of wakefulness that are interjected throughout our existence then. And maybe that sounds a little weird because, again, it's not our typical way of thinking, but some have suggested it in some movies, some books, some authors. And he kind of says some things, that the science is suggesting that seem to kind of maybe support that idea. After all, we essentially start life. He talks about how we essentially start life in an essentially sleeping, 24 hours sleeping, state, that not once during the 24-hour period of, a baby in utero is that baby's experience one we would describe as wakefulness. No, it's not until, I think he says, the third trimester where it approaches what we might consider some semblance of wakefulness. So we start off in this very, sleep-consumed state, and then only slowly over time do we, does more and more of our 24-hour period or cycle, does that become more and more filled with wakefulness. But then as we age and get older, maybe the reverse is true, I don't know, until then we return to our primordial, more fundamental state of sleep, or not existing, or not being awake. I don't know how to put it, but hopefully this kind of point's somewhat becoming clear. So he talks about that point about the, in utero baby, pages 78 and 79. So talking about in utero development, he says, quote, the 24-hour period contains a mismatch of approximately 6 hours of NREM sleep, 6 hours of REM sleep, and 12 hours of an intermediary sleep state that we cannot confidently say is REM or NREM sleep, but certainly is not full wakefulness. It is only when the fetus enters the final trimester that the glimmers of real wakefulness emerge, end quote. So that really, resonated with me in terms of some of the things I thought about, especially wrestling with the idea of personal identity and what's most fundamental to us, and what does death really look like if sleep, which some of us think is non-existing, is actually the more fundamental state for us, is what, so lots of interesting related questions. I thought this is kind of related. On page 161, he talks about how, there's obviously a recurring theme throughout the book is like how regenerative sleep is. And it's just, it is, basically, there's a reason why we sleep so much when we're sick, right? Because that's the best thing the body can do for itself is to sleep, and because sleeping apparently is so regenerative in nature. And there's a sense in which, he talks about how like being awake is in itself like toxic or harmful. And I think he was talking about how he related to his discussion of Alzheimer's. There's like this something that gets secreted over time as we're awake, and it's especially the case, I think, in the case of Alzheimer's patients. Um, but this, over anytime we're awake, is being secreted, and so when we're sleeping, then that process stops. And so he says then, page 161, quote, phrased differently and perhaps more simply, wakefulness is low-level brain damage, while sleep is neurological sanitation, end quote. Of course, that's simplifying things quite a bit, but, it echoes this sort of overall sort of wonder, what is the most fundamental state? What is reality at the most fundamental level? Should we be rooting it in our wakefulness, or are we maybe misguided in our tendency to think of it in that way? Okay, so that was kind of part one. Hopefully you got a feel for part one there. Part two gets into basically all the problems that arise if you don't sleep. Okay, why sleeping is good and sleep deprivation is bad. So we've established the fact, every species sleeps. What sleep looks like, it's different by species, and kind of the different elements and types of sleep, especially as is the case for humans. Okay, now let's turn our attention to all the ways it's terrible to not get sleep and all the ways it's really good to get sleep. And so that's basically what part two does. So he's talked about, for example, sleep, and particularly NREM, and particularly stage 2 of NREM sleep improves memory and transitions memories. Again, I intimated this earlier, from our short-term, memory to then long-term memory. That's happening again in that NREM stage 2 in particular. So he talked about that on page 114. I had hinted at that again in earlier discussions. Okay, so I'm going to go step by step here. So first he says, quote, the more deep NREM sleep, the more information an individual remembered the next day, end quote. Quote, before having slept, participants were fetching memories from the short-term storage site of the hippocampus, that temporary warehouse which is a vulnerable place to live for any long duration of time if you are a new memory. But things looked very different by the next morning. The memories had moved. After the full night of sleep, participants were now retrieving that same information from the neocortex, which sits at the top of the brain, a region that serves as the long-term storage site for fact-based memories, where they can now live safely, perhaps in perpetuity, end quote. So next quote, the slow brain waves of deep NREM had served as a courier service, transporting memory packets from a temporary storage hold, the hippocampus, to a more secure permanent home, the cortex. In doing so, sleep had helped future-proof those memories, end quote. And so that again captures what I was alluding to earlier, the job of NREM sleep, again, solidifying what we've come across, our new experiences, and reinforcing those, making sure those have a degree of permanence, if they're vital anyway. And he does talk about how the sense in which, that's important because we only have a limited, our short-term memory is limited, right? It's like a computer with limited storage. We're in many ways there are many ways that we are like a computer, but he does establish ways in which we're different. But that's, one of the ways we only have a certain amount of storage space, at least in that short-term sense, and so we gotta free it up, right? And that's what NREM sleep, especially stage 2 again, really lets us do, frees up that short-term drive, right? And by again relaying the important stuff to long-term memory storage. So where it gets really interesting to me, page 119, he talks about how we can filter and manipulate what we remember. Okay, so I've kind of hinted at this, right? So deep NREM sleep, we move to long-term storage what we want, right? What's essential or vital. But what about the stuff we don't want? Well, we do have this ability to kind of filter what we remember. And so he cites, first example of this is a study, I believe this is the one, so this is from page 119, where researchers So the first thing they did was like pair a certain sound. They paired sounds with the words, and then during the participants' deep NREM sleep, they would chime that same sound. And when they did that, the people would the next day, the participants, when they would play those sounds, right, would remember more of the words than the next day. So let me back up and make sure I'm clearly explaining this. So, you know, all participants were shown words, right, and these words were paired with sounds. Then some participants, right, they were all, were sleeping. Some participants, then the researchers would make these sounds, right, that were correlated with the words as they were in these stages of NREM sleep, right. Those participants that were exposed to those sounds during those stages of sleep remembered remarkably better, right, words versus the other participants that weren't, that didn't have it reinforced through the sounds, right, during the NREM sleep. So again, one way in which we can sort of tinker with what we remember and what we don't. And so, you want to study for the exam, play something over and over, right? I guess in the background. How do I have something here written? So play a recording of what you most want to remember while sleeping. That was my note as I read that part of the book. I've got all kinds of little notes like that throughout, but again, that was with respect to our NREM sleep. You can sort of facilitate what you want to remember by affecting that process, right, as you're sleeping, which again boggles my mind a little bit. So page 121, he cites a similar experiment. Oh, so this is the one. Wow, this is where it gets really interesting to me. So page 121, he cites a different experiment, similar upshot, where sets of words, certain ones were tagged as remember, other ones were tagged as don't remember. Okay? And so when you go through and before you went to sleep, go through and associate these words remember, other ones don't remember, that would literally affect your ability then to remember and then also forget the ones you didn't want to remember. Fascinating stuff. So I'm just going to quote. So this page from 121. Our question was this: does sleep improve the retention of all words equally, or does sleep obey the waking command only to remember some items while forgetting others, based on the tags we had connected to each? The results were clear. Sleep powerfully, yet very selectively, boosted the retention of those words previously tagged for remembering, yet actively avoided the strengthening of those memories tagged for forgetting. Participants who did not sleep showed no such impressive parsing and differential savings of the memories. So again, so the idea is, if you have, not only is this good for like studying for exams, but if you have bad memories, things you want to forget, tell yourself literally before you go to bed. Seems to be the upshot. Forget. And so as I was reading this book, it's kind of funny. I'd start to implement all these kinds of things that I was learning, right? And so I began and still do. If there's extreme sort of things that happen in my day, focus on, remember, yada yada yada, great things that happen throughout the day, and tell myself, don't focus on, forget all this crap that happened. And even to the point, like, so I play hockey in an adult league and I'll get injured, and so I'll even tell myself, again, I don't know if there's anything to this, a lot of this sounds like magic, but heal your shoulder, focus on healing your shoulder, and 3 days after I couldn't move my arm, right, I'm able to gain a lot of the motion back. But again, is this magic or is this science? I don't know. A lot of this sounds crazy to me, but you can apparently, again, kind of filter what it is you remember and forget. So something to keep in mind. 1 second. So page 120, he kind of expresses some concerns about this ability, right? This ability to like control our life recollection, more or less, in some sense, right? So he sort of speaks to some concerns then. Quote, you would have the power to write and rewrite your own remembered life narrative, or, more concerning, that of someone else, end quote. Because think about, again, what the experimenters did in that one study, right? They demonstrably, like, affected what people then remembered. Well, his worry is, then, could we do the same thing to, if we're laying right by someone or sitting right by someone else, whispering to them as they're sleeping, can we affect then their recollection of things that have happened, right? If you just sit there and say the same thing over and over, I did not take your beer, or I did not take your stuff, over and over. Will that change then their memory of what actually happened? I don't know. Again, is this magic or science? It seems to be what some of this is suggesting. I thought it was interesting. Obviously, sleep deprivation, not getting enough sleep, terrible. He speaks to that throughout the book. But it's so catastrophic, he mentions this a few times, that the Guinness Book of World Records no longer acknowledges and keeps records of, longest time without sleep. And in fact, they felt so strongly about it, they took away retroactively all the past records because they didn't want people to even think about it. That's how bad sleep deprivation is. He talks about, again, how it's arguably the greatest form of torture is sleep deprivation. That you will want sleep more than, say, if you're starving, then you'll want food if you're starving. Crazy stuff. And of course, so this is something that's fascinating to me. It's a general logical bias that you read a lot about. People that aren't smart think they're the most likely to think they're smart. People that aren't, this is all borne out by research. People that aren't experts in certain fields are the more likely to think they are experts in those fields. And conversely, people that are the experts in certain fields are the most likely to think that they're not as smart in those fields. So this is a common tendency of human beings, right, to just completely screw everything up, right, depending on how they actually are, right, how we actually are. We have tended to not have a clear vision of actual reality, right, and so same thing when it comes to sleep deprivation, right? When we're sleep deprived, we don't actually tend to realize how sleep deprived we are or how terrible things are. Reminds me of a discussion that I had this past weekend. And same buddy, Dave, that I actually ordered this book for then last night after I finished it. Given our discussions this past weekend, he routinely gets like less than 6 hours of sleep every night. And I think if I recall our conversation correctly, he couldn't remember the last time he got 7 hours of sleep. He texted me the next night and said he got over 7. No, but I'm like, so Dave, how do you feel during the day? Do you feel like you're a zombie? Because that's always the thing that kind of stuck out to me. I felt like I could, when I would get like say 5, 6 hours of sleep, I feel like I could get by. A couple things would stick out, but I kind of feel like a zombie, like half there almost, right? And then I'd also get very snappy and irritable and was far less patient. And those are the things that really stood out to me. And so I said, Dave, do you feel like you're living a zombie-like existence? And he's like, no, I feel fine. I get everything done, and so on and so forth. But then the other guy and I that were there chatting with him were like, but you haven't ever had 7 to 8 hours, right? An actual decent night's sleep. So you don't actually have a baseline against which to compare it, right? And it reminded me that it's exactly what Matthew Walker points out. People that are sleep deprived, they don't realize it. Oftentimes because, like Dave, he doesn't have a healthy baseline to compare it to. How does he know that he's not actually walking around like a zombie if he doesn't know what it's like to walk around at a completely 100% level, right? Which would require the requisite decent night's sleep. And again, nothing against Dave. I tended to think that way too. And we shared. Actually, he said many of the same things with respect to how he thinks of sleep as like not existing. There's far a lot of other things I'd rather do than take a nap or sleep. Same, that resonated so much with me. That's exactly how I've thought for so long. But again, the whole idea. Well, I seem to be fine. Everything seems to be okay. Well, how do you know that? Because you don't know what you would be at 100% or what your best really is. And so Walker talks about that, page 137. So he says, quote, 60 years of scientific research prevent me from accepting anyone who tells me that he or she can, quote, get by on just 4 or 5 hours of sleep at night just fine, end quote, end quote. So again, that was page 137. We might think we're doing okay. As the research suggests, most of us who are sleep deprived will think, but we're not. He talks about our recycle rate, which is, what's our recycle rate? This is an interesting term. Basically, it's like how long we can go without sleep before our behavior is affected, like in an objective fashion, before we can tell your behavior is being impaired. And come to find out, so this is page 140. So we talked a little bit about this. It is, I think, 16 hours. Yeah. Page 140, quote, the recycle rate of a human being is around 16 hours. After 16 hours of being awake, the brain begins to fail. The longest, this brings back just a memory of graduate school at University of Kansas when I had a paper due. I think it was my mill seminar, where it wasn't that I procrastinated, but I always overdid things. It seemed like I would write these super long papers, spend way too long on them. But towards the end, then as I was completing the paper, I literally almost stayed up like two full, like 48 hours, and it was a very memorable experience for me because I got to this point where I'm making connection. My mind, I could not get it to move. Like I could not, there's nothing more I could do. No matter how much I tried to focus, I couldn't make any new connections or say what I wanted to say. It was very vivid experience for me because I never had that experience where no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make a connection or type exactly what I wanted to. It was eerie and a weird experience. And so that whole notion of recycle rate kind of reminded me of that. So that took 48 hours where I was like, oh. And he goes on. He talks about somebody who was somehow like 6 months without sleep. I don't know how that's possible. Of course, the guy dies. I mean, that's terrible. It's only because of diseases, usually, where the person's going 6 months without sleep. But I'm thinking 2 days. Wow, I can't imagine going longer than that. And so I could really sympathize them with a lot of what he's saying regarding sleep deprivation being one of the most extreme forms of torture, because if someone were to force me to stay awake at that point, I don't know what would have happened. And so then go back to this recycle rate, just to think then that, far sooner than that, I should have probably stopped writing the paper far sooner than that, because around 16 hours, probably fluctuates a little bit by individual, but around 16 hours after first, awakening, then you're going to start declining in your performance. So I thought that was an interesting idea, that notion of recycle rate. One other theme that I would mention or at least another one that is definitely recurring throughout here, is not necessarily that like drunk driving isn't bad, but he constantly points out how, drunk driving, as bad as it is, drowsy driving is far, far worse because it kills far, 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 far more people. And so that's a recurring theme throughout, just how bad drowsy driving is and how many of us routinely are guilty of it. And he talks about like micro sleeps, how that happens and how that can affect driving and so on. So page 145, I thought was a nice summary quote here. Oh, so this actually, I remember him making this, quoting this on the Joe Rogan podcast as well. So he's quoting one of his research colleagues, Dr. Thomas Roth, at the Henry Ford Hospital in Detroit, who once said, quote, the number of people who can survive on 5 hours of sleep or less without any impairment, expressed as a percent of the population and rounded to a whole number, is 0, end quote. So again, that's page 145. So that speaks again to how vital sleep is. And we can try to kid ourselves about how important it is, or that, we can get by with a little less, but he's saying, no, the evidence is there. You need it. And every physiological process seems to be affected. Not only does every species need it, but every part of our well-being seems to be affected by it, and then adversely affected if we are deprived from sleep. So page 155, he says, quote, even the most elemental units of the learning process, the production of proteins that form the building blocks of memories within these synapses, are stunted by the state of sleep loss. And so he's constantly talking about, even these basic elementary processes involved in, our bodily functions, they're affected by sleep deprivation. Similarly, he says, quote, like water, so this is from page 164, like water from a burst pipe in your home, the effects of sleep deprivation will seep into every nook and cranny of biology, down into your cells, even altering your most fundamental self, your DNA, end quote. And he even makes it a point, I thought this was interesting too, towards the end, there's these 3 basic pillars of health, right? Diet, exercise, and sleep, okay? Which coming into this book, I had kind of refined myself. I mentioned this book that really helped me with my diet, and then I've started running and exercising more, doing more aerobic stuff. But sleep was really the one that I had the most work to do on, I guess you could say. And he makes the argument that actually sleep's the most fundamental. It's not just one of the three pillars. It's like sleep's the most important. And that these other two pillars, right, diet and exercise, that remove good sleep from the equation, they're not going to matter, and they're significantly adversely affected by deficient sleep. Speaking to that point, he says, take away the bedrock of sleep. So this is a quote from page 164. Take away the bedrock of sleep or weaken it just a little, and careful eating or physical exercise become less than effective, as we shall see, end quote. And of course, he does go on to show that just that. He talks about, he gives, cites ample studies that you feel hungry or in fact eat more when you're sleep deprived. So your diet's significantly affected. And then, our ability, and I can speak to this one, and I think most of us too, right, who try to work out every now and then. When you're sleep deprived, it's a lot harder to get out there and run or do whatever, right, lift the weights. And so he says, quote from page 175, making matters worse, the less an individual sleeps, the less energy he or she feels they have, and the more sedentary and less willing to exercise they are in real world settings, end quote. Duh, I definitely, that point definitely resonates with me. Right, so again, this idea that sleep is the foundation upon which even these other crucial things rest, diet and exercise. Another big theme, caffeine and alcohol, no good. No good when it comes to sleep, and therefore no good when it comes to your health. Caffeine, so I read this book, Fast Food Nation, over the holidays about 4 years ago, and so the last time I had meat, so I stopped eating meat for health reasons after reading this book. Never thought I could actually do that. Never thought I could successfully be a vegetarian. But the last time I had meat was December 31st, 2016. And so we're almost 4 years later, and I still haven't had meat. And the more general point, not to try to support vegetarianism here, but I focused on diet a lot after this book. Huge facet obviously is diet, and then health, exercising routinely. But if you're gonna screw up your sleep again, the argument seems to be none of that will matter near as much. And he actually talks about one thing I didn't have in my notes too, like taking a flu shot. Great thing, he thinks. But if you don't actually get the required nights of sleep after you get the flu shot, it's basically ineffective. You might as well not even get the flu shot. So all this stuff seems to be predicated on and whether they're successful, all these other facets that we associate with health, and whether they're successful seems to be predicated on whether or not, first and foremost, you get a decent night's sleep. So caffeine and alcohol, reoccurring theme. So I mentioned, stop eating meat and became a vegetarian, and so that was the end of 2016, and like the next summer, then in 2017, I drank more coffee than anyone I know up until the summer of 2017, literally like a pot a day. And I would get killer headaches if I stopped drinking, or if I didn't have, a cup of coffee, or, the requisite amount I needed, would suffer terribly. Well, I was on my way home from visiting a buddy in Chicago on this day in the summer of 2017. Didn't intend to stop drinking caffeine at all, but I realized after this long drive, it was late at night, and I hadn't had any caffeine. And I thought, if I ever want to try not drinking caffeine anymore, this would be the time, because I don't have a headache. And so I kind of pushed through, and ever since, no caffeine. I should take that back, with very few exceptions. Like if I have a lot of grating, I might drink a regular cup of coffee, which then after you don't drink it every day, all day, wow, I then regarnered that appreciation for how strong caffeine actually is. All it takes is like half a cup of regular coffee, and I'm, whoa, right? You then actually appreciate what it's doing for you. But anyway, the whole point was I stopped drinking caffeine back then, but man, I drink a ton of it, and I can appreciate sort of the stuff he's talking about in terms of how it disrupts sleep. And I think a lot of us probably can. He talks a lot about how caffeine, and not just caffeine, but alcohol as well, how it's disruptive to sleep. And I remember facing a lot of the issues before I stopped drinking caffeine for the most part back in 2017, how the sort of sleep-related issues I would have that were probably related to the caffeine I was ingesting. And by the way, when I became a vegetarian, that wasn't intended either. When I picked this up back in December of 2016, I was never planning to become, to stop eating meat, never planned to stop drinking caffeine, but here we are. And so anyway, so he talks a lot about, again, the connection between caffeine and sleep disruption. Same thing with alcohol. So we talk about caffeine disrupting NREM sleep and therefore brain maturation. And so he brings this up because he can't stand that kids are allowed to drink caffeine. He thinks there's no reason to ever allow kids to drink caffeine because, again, it disrupts our NREM sleep, which is so vital for new experiences and learning new stuff. Which, when is that most important but for kids? So he cites the research on page 91 regarding that and how bad that is for kids. So I mentioned alcohol and how terrible that is. It suppresses dreams and REM sleep. He talks about that specifically in a number of places, but particularly on page 82. He says, quote, alcohol can inflict the same selective removal of REM sleep. Alcohol is one of the most powerful suppressors of REM sleep that we know of. Right? And he talks about how a lot of times, we don't realize how alcohol is actually affecting us through the night because we don't remember how much it's waking us up, but it's actually continually waking us up through the night. And, they do studies and they can tell when the person's waking up. So the whole point is, though, we might not subjectively associate it with all the alcohol we drank when we're extremely tired the next day, but that's probably why. He points out that, again, drinking alcohol, that will continually sort of wake you up. Ruins learning even nights later, he talks about. So 273 to 274, this is a pretty interesting study. So it's a kind of a longer quote, so bear with me. So he's talking about this study. On day 7, so it's 273, on day 7, participants in the control condition remembered everything they had originally learned, even showing an enhancement of abstraction and retention of knowledge relative to initial levels of learning, just as we'd expect from good sleep. In contrast, those who had their sleep laced with alcohol on the first night after learning suffered what can conservatively be described as partial amnesia 7 days later, forgetting more than 50% of all that original knowledge. Okay. This fits well with evidence we discussed earlier, that of the brain's non-negotiable requirement for sleep the first night after learning for the purposes of memory processing. The real surprise came in the results of the third group of participants. Despite getting 2 full nights of natural sleep after initial learning, having their sleep doused with alcohol on the third night still resulted in almost the same degree of amnesia. 40% of the knowledge they had worked so hard to establish on day 1 was forgotten. End quote. So apparently alcohol is like a memory, just makes you forget stuff, right? And so then, of course, it's like, well, how far down the road can alcohol affect my memories, right? And so, or the flip side of that question is, how long does it take before a memory is solidified and before you won't actually forget it? And he talks about that, actually. He says, we don't actually quite know the answer to that. How long does it take for a memory to get completely solidified? Or as he puts it, quote, how long is it before those new memories are finally safe? We actually do not yet know. And so he says, with respect to, and that's the end of the quote, with respect to alcohol, he actually advises, if you're going to drink, go out in the morning, right? Drink at the pub in the morning, so that way you can metabolize it fully before you try to go to sleep at night. So I guess in some sense that sounds like don't drink at all, maybe. So in sum, clearly bad to not sleep, right? As he puts it on page 164, quote, the shorter your sleep, the shorter your life, end quote. Part 3 is how and why we dream, right? So that covers basically the magical phenomena. I really don't know how else to describe dreaming other than magical phenomenon, honestly. The magical phenomenon of dreaming and REM sleep in general. So that's what part 3 is all about. He distinguishes, right? Dreaming and REM sleep aren't one and the same, okay? So he talks a little bit about that in a few different places. So for example, page 193, quote, REM sleep is not the only time during sleep when we dream. So we're actually dreaming during our NREM sleep as well. Indeed, if you use a liberal definition of dreaming as any mental activity reported upon awakening from sleep, such as "I was thinking about rain," then you technically dream in all stages of sleep. If I awake you from the deepest stage of NREM sleep, there's a 0 to 20% chance you will report some type of bland thought like this. As you are falling asleep or exiting sleep, the dreamlike experiences you have tend to be visually or movement-based. But dreams, as most of us think of them, those hallucinogenic, motoric, emotional, and bizarre experiences with a rich narrative, come from REM sleep. And many sleep researchers limit their definition of true dreaming to that which occurs in REM sleep, end quote. So that's pages 193 to 194. So he's pointing out that dreaming, what we associate with dreaming, like if you were to be woken up and be like, yeah, I was thinking about some, general thing, you at any stage in your sleep, you could be woken up and there's up to a 20% chance you'll say that you were thinking of something, right? So you're dreaming in that sense throughout your sleep. But what we typically associate with dreaming, okay, that's that's just exclusively the domain of REM sleep. Page 207, he also speaks to how dreaming in particular is needed and not just REM sleep. Quote, using this framework, we have found 2 core benefits of REM sleep. Both functional benefits require not just that you have REM sleep, but that you dream, and dream about specific things. REM sleep is necessary, but REM sleep alone is not sufficient. End quote. Again, that's page 207. So it's dreaming in particular that seems to deliver a lot of the benefits associated with REM sleep or dreaming. Okay? It's dreaming in particular. So he talks about how this is on page 195. Again, I mentioned earlier how we kind of seem to be smarter in a sense when we're dreaming. We're also more emotional. He says on page 195, quote, these emotional regions of the brain are up to 30% more active in REM sleep compared to when we are awake, end quote. So we're apparently even more emotional as well while we're dreaming. And that makes sense maybe because, a lot of the job of our dreams seems to be to help us cleanse ourselves in terms of our emotions and, forget about the bad stuff that happened and focus and accentuate the good stuff, the good feelings. That's where dreams really come into play, he seems to suggest. So we're way more emotional, and yet what's turned off seems to be our rational thought and logical, analytic processes. So he gives a nice summary of that on page 196. Quote, REM sleep can therefore be considered as a state characterized by strong activation in visual, motor, emotional, and autobiographical memory regions of the brain, yet a relative deactivation in regions that control rational thought, end quote. So not so rational, very emotional in our dreams. So naturally, there's an interesting question, where do our dreams come from? And he spends a lot of time sort of getting into that. And I don't know that I was necessarily satisfied or that he's even necessarily satisfied with, what the research suggests. It definitely, dreams definitely do seem to, again, pertain to the emotions we're enduring in our everyday lives. So he talks about this on page 204. So he says, Stickgold, this is a quote, Stickgold did find a strong and predictive daytime signal in the static of nighttime dream reports, emotions. Between 35 and 55% of emotional themes and concerns that participants were having while they were awake during the day powerfully and unambiguously resurfaced in the dreams they were having at night, end quote. So yeah, these emotions seem to be very much at play in our dreams. And he talks about how our dreams seem to have these 2 primary functions. He talks about that on page 207. I mentioned, right, helping us deal with the emotional baggage of our everyday lives, if you will, and then also fostering creativity. So 207, he says, so what are these 2 functions of dreams? What do they help us do? Quote, the first function involves nursing our emotional and mental health and is the focus of this chapter. The second is problem solving and creativity. Okay, so 2 basic functions that dreaming has been discovered to sort of fulfill for us, right? Managing our everyday emotions and then fostering and facilitating our creativity and our problem-solving abilities. Okay. Sort of related to that emotional aspect, right, is, well, what happens then if you deprive people of sleep, and specifically that dreaming ability? Well, then they tend to become more cynical and pessimistic and irritable and impatient. And this is something that really resonated with me. I asked Dave, who I mentioned earlier, when I started sleeping more, then as I read this book and went to bed earlier and so on and so forth, I really felt like I yelled less. So we both said of each other, right, oh, I never imagined you to be, the impatient type, or one who would get on your kids too much. And we're both thinking this of one another. And then we're both like, yeah, actually behind closed doors, right, we can be irritable. And, like all of us, right, we get on our kids. But sometimes definitely one of the things I noticed when, I didn't get enough sleep is I would be irritable and a lot more likely to snap sooner, and so I asked him about this. And so again, this whole point that Walker's bringing up, that dreams help us, again, manage those emotions, and also makes us more on even keel in general then, right? We're not as likely then to snap as soon as we otherwise would be if we were sleep deprived. And so Walker draws attention to some of the research that backs that up too. He says, where is this? 216 to 217. So pages 216 to 217. He says, quote, the sleep-deprived participant slipped into a default of fear bias, believing even gentle or somewhat friendly-looking faces were menacing. The outside world had become a more threatening and aversive place when the brain lacked REM sleep. Untruthfully so, reality and perceived reality were no longer the same in the eyes of the sleepless brain. By removing REM sleep, we had quite literally removed participants' level-headed ability to read the social world around them, end quote. So it affects our emotional stability, right, when we don't get enough sleep. And again, that's one of the things that I could definitely sympathize with, or that really resonated with me. And that, after changing my sleeping habits, I feel the effects have been palpable for me. I do feel like I am more emotionally stable, if you will. Not that I ever had any huge issues, and not that Dave does, or, most of us, right? But that's not to say that we couldn't improve, right? And then getting that, more sleep and having a better baseline to compare yourself with, you might realize that you can still improve, and that things could be better. Yeah, you can get by. You're not screaming at your kids all the time, but maybe it could be a little better. Maybe you won't. Like another thing, like if you're a driver, for example, who gets annoyed at all the other drivers, like I used to sometimes, that doesn't happen at all when you get enough sleep. I mean, it's a lot less likely, I should put it that way, right? You're not going to be nearly as easily agitated again. And I think that has a pervasive effect throughout your life. Anyway, not to get all philosophical on you. So I mentioned, obviously, so we've spoken to like the emotional healing nature of dreams and REM sleep, but then also there's this creative aspect, and I alluded to this before, how it is problem solving and creative in nature. He references Dmitry Mendeleev and his periodic table breakthrough. He talks about that on page 220 of the book, where he tried everything he could to figure out the basic essence of these various elements and to categorize them in a meaningful way, and couldn't figure it out, and then had a breakthrough thanks to a dream. Same thing with Paul McCartney. Cites, musicians, several musicians, famous musicians have, reveled at the nature of dreams and how that's facilitated their creativity. He mentions Paul McCartney, specifically, some of the Beatles songs, specifically Yesterday, was, I guess, inspired by a dream. And then Keith Richards, this was interesting, I'm going to read it, the guitarist for the Rolling Stones. He writes of Keith Richards, quote, so this is page 221 to 222. Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones is arguably the best sleep-inspired story, which gave rise to the opening riff of their song Satisfaction. Richards would routinely keep a guitar and tape recorder at his bedside to record ideas that would come to him in the night. And so he goes on page 222 then to describe Richards' recollection then of, recording himself in this one night when he was sleeping, and then waking up the next day. So I put it, this is Richards recollecting this on page 222 of the book. So I put it back to the beginning and pushed play, and there, in some sort of ghostly version, is the opening lines to Satisfaction. It was a whole verse of it. And after that, there's 40 minutes of me snoring, but there's the song in its embryo, and I actually dreamt the damn thing, end quote. So all kinds of examples. And then probably the most interesting one, Thomas Edison, who apparently, is famous for like telling everyone how little he slept, but I guess he was like a notorious napper, though at the same time, a daytime napper. And in fact, he was such a tool for him. He actually, Walker points out that he described it as the genius gap. But anyway, so Walker describes like Edison and how he would, during these daytime naps, would like configure pots and pans so that when he would dream and there'd be this subtle muscle tension, it would like wake him up. And because these pans and so on would move, would wake him up. And then, so as he puts it, quote, so this is Walker recalling, or sort of describing what Edison would do. Quote, at the moment he began to dream, his muscle tone would relax. That's what would happen. It would relax. And he would release the ball bearings, right? Because remember, your brain's paralyzing your body. So you'd relax. That would release the ball bearings, which would crash on the metal saucepan below, waking him up. He would then write down all the creative ideas that were flooding his dreaming mind. Genius, wouldn't you agree? End quote. So, apparently people have been on to the marvels of the creative dreaming nature for quite some time. So we're smarter and more creative during REM and dreaming states than we are during our NREM and wakefulness. This boggles my mind. So I've been meaning this, right? Or referring to this. We are actually smarter when we're dreaming. How is this possible? So what they did, this is a different study. So this is page, again, 224. They took participants, they gave them anagrams, right? So it's like a word, but the letters are mixed up. And the only ones where it could be rearranged so that there's only one word, right? So they did this study. And then what they did, there's this thing called sleep inertia. So when you first wake up, right, you're not completely to the awake state for like a period of time, like a minute or so. And so what they would do is they would have people try to solve these anagrams in their wakefulness state, right, awake. Then also during deep NREM states of sleep, they would wake them up and then immediately have them try to do these, solve these anagrams. And then also during REM sleep. And they were significantly better when they were dreaming versus when they were in deep states of sleep, NREM sleep, or when they were awake. So, quote, overall, problem-solving abilities rocketed up with participants solving 15 to 35% more puzzles when emerging from REM sleep compared with awakenings from NREM sleep or during daytime waking performance. End quote. That boggles my mind that we are smarter when we're sleeping, when we're dreaming, than when we're awake. And so I mentioned how a lot of times there's all these comparisons to us and computers, right? Well, we are distinct in this capacity of this creative capacity, which is facilitated by our dreaming and REM state. So Walker sort of reflects on how we're just differentiated by that creative capacity, which is again facilitated by our dreaming. He reflects on that, how that differentiates us from otherwise very computer-like processes that we seem to have, right? How that differentiates us from computers, though. Quote, this is from 228. Some may consider this informational daisy chaining to be trivial, but it is one of the key operations differentiating your brain from your computer. Computers can store thousands of individual files with precision, but standard computers do not intelligently interlink those files in numerous and creative combinations. Then, one of the most fascinating research experiments. I've alluded to this. Lucid dreaming, controlling our dreams. He references this towards the end of part 3. Lucid dreaming, he says, and I quote from page 233, scientists had gained objective brain-based proof that lucid dreamers can control when and what they dream while they are dreaming, end quote. So what they did was they told these so-called lucid dreamers before they had them go to sleep, and they had them, things hooked up to them, right? These scientists are observing them. Look left when you're going to try, like, have your eyes look left 3 distinct times when you're trying to move your, say, a particular arm or leg. So do certain things with your eyes when you're in your dream doing certain things. And what they found was that these lucid dreamers, in fact, moved their eyes in correspondence with, right, the movements that were happening in their dreams. And they could tell, right, that these movements were happening in their dreams because, the research matched up with it and so on. So based on, they still, while they were dreaming in the REM stage, right, as measured and so on, right, they could still control and manipulate sort of what was happening. Now, they weren't really raising their right arm, right, because it was paralyzed. But the same parts lit up in their brain as when they were awake and actually moving the right arm, right? And they were indicating to, at the same time, the researchers that that's what they were trying to do. Fascinating stuff. So again, that comes from page 233 of the book. And I couldn't help but wonder again, why is it our brain permits our eyes to still move? And maybe he mentioned this somewhere in here and I just forgot, but that's still a question I have. Okay, so part 4 is called From Sleeping Pills to Society Transformed. It covers basically sleep disorders and more or less this kind of vision for the future in terms of improving our individuals' sleep, and then like trying to do that as collectively or as a society, things we can do to try to implement better sleep habits. So he raises an interesting ethical issue. So he talks a lot about, I referenced the guy that stayed awake for like 6 months. And he talks about like, our science is getting more advanced. We see what's happening in their brains when this sort of thing happens. It is a disease. Certain things are happening physiologically, and in that case, there's literally no cure. And everybody that had that, I forgot what the disease was. Literally everyone's died that has it. But it's genetic, and so we have like the ability kind of to foresee potential of that happening then. And so he raises an interesting, I thought, philosophical or ethical point on page 256. He says, quote, "The genetic certainty raises a eugenically fraught question. If your family's genes mean that you could one day be struck down by the fatal inability to sleep, would you want to be told your fate? Furthermore, if you know that fate and have not yet had children, would that change your decision to do so, knowing you are a gene carrier and that you have the potential to prevent a next step transmission of the disease?" Good question, Matthew. I'm not sure what the answers to those questions are, but I mean, that's becoming a reality, it sounds like, that some people are going to be facing. Fortunately, very, 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 very few, which is why he says, why there's no cure, because it's not profitable for drug companies to look into it when there's so few people suffering from it. He goes on about the various issues, the reasons why so few people are getting the requisite sleep that they should. Blue LED lights and artificial light in general are a huge evolutionary issue. It's affecting us big time. So on page 270, he talks about that. Quote, "Using LED devices at night impacts our natural sleep rhythms, the quality of our sleep, and how alert we feel during the day. I, like many of you, have seen young children using electronic tablets at every opportunity throughout the day and evening. And if you've heard me in some of my other videos, this is a big concern of mine, how much time our kids spend on screens. Quote, "But such technology is also enriching their eyes and brains with powerful blue light that has a damaging effect on sleep, the sleep that young developing brains so desperately need in order to flourish," end quote. It's a big issue for him. Another thing he talks a lot about, which was fascinating, that I didn't necessarily think about, was like alarm clocks. For so much of our history, we didn't like force ourselves to wake up at any certain time. And we're the only species, as he says on page 280, quote, "No other species demonstrates this unnatural act of prematurely and artificially terminating sleep." And he talks about how this is a huge physiological, should be a huge physiological no-no for us. Like, it's alarming and jarring our system when we force it to wake up. He says, quote, "If alarming your heart quite literally were not bad enough, using the snooze feature means that you will repeatedly inflict that cardiovascular assault again and again within a short span of time." That's the other thing. So not only are alarm clocks bad, but if you were like me growing up and I would like purposely set it minutes ahead of when I had to wake up, like always like 15 minutes, because I enjoyed that feeling of, oh, I can still sleep some more. Right? But apparently that's what's even worse. I shouldn't have been doing that. There's a lot of ranting against sleeping pills, which personally, again, I can really sympathize with. I have some scary, scary memories. My father has notoriously struggled with sleep. Huge issue for him throughout his life, and then so I saw this growing up, and still see it. And so for like decades now, it seems like he's been taking Ambien, and I've swore off Ambien. I've said I will never take it. Just because I saw what it would do to him, and I knew in my heart there's no way that this can be good for him, even if it lets you sleep or gets you to sleep faster. Given what he would do, like eat entire meals without even knowing it, stuff like that. Eat like 3 times in a night, not realize it. Have no idea what's happening. I knew that probably not good. And so Walker, citing the research, demonstrates over and over and again how bad, not just Ambien, but Ambien in particular, though, because it is, one of the most predominant ones. Specifically, yes, Ambien, but then other ones as well, they're not good. They're memory erasers, as he puts it, and increased death and cancer rates. And he cites the research, specifically pages 285 to 288 on that. And he says, he cites the research that shows while you might think it's doing you better, it's actually not producing quality sleep. It's actually hurting us in many, many, many ways. So he talks about that. And, there's this question, well, why aren't these bad ill effects of, these sleeping pills being made public? Why doesn't everybody know about them? Well, it's because of the corporate mentality that gets in the way, right? And he acknowledges that. So he talks about that on page 289, for example. So he asks, quote, shouldn't drug companies be more transparent about the current evidence and risks surrounding sleeping pills? Well, then he alludes to what I think is the obvious answer, why they're not. Quote, consider that the original Star Wars movies, some of the highest grossing films of all time, required more than 40 years to amass $3 billion in revenue. It took Ambien just 24 months to amass $4 billion in sales profit, end quote. Are they going to want to take Ambien off the shelves? Probably not. So also then, I thought it was kind of funny going back through this and preparing for the episode. He's talking about one of his, a noble goal, talking about the motivated goal of trying to help people live healthier lives. And then just below that, I write, you can see my chicken scratches there. I write, that's not what matters to governments and corporations. So that's going to be a big hurdle then, right? Because, well, if you've seen some of my other videos, right, I think governments are too interconnected with corporations. And so, why aren't we seeing improvement? Because it's not profitable, I would argue, and he seems to agree in some sense. I also would note real quick that he had some interesting reflections on like the virus-like nature of sleep deprivation and how it affects us socially, right? So, I mean, everywhere from like he cites research that when the boss is sleep deprived, well, that affects then how the vibes he gives off to the employees and how effective they become. And we always think that we're effective, but actually no, we're significantly less effective when we're sleep deprived. Of course, we don't realize it or acknowledge it when we're sleep deprived, as mentioned earlier. But then, so too, even if the boss is doing a good job, right? If the employees are sleep deprived, their view of the boss is going to be skewed, right? So there's all these like peripheral ways that we're being affected by sleep deprivation that we might not even think of, right? All these sort of ways that we're interconnected, and that either my lack of sleep or your lack of sleep is going to then affect these various elements of our interaction. So I thought that was pretty interesting. Again, he talked about that in part 4. And the last thing I guess I'd mention in part 4 before I kind of articulate some of my final thoughts is towards the end, he talks about how, a lot of our psychological illnesses, the symptoms for those, they actually mirror the symptoms for sleep deprivation. And so he says in general, I thought this was telling, he's giving a specific case. He says, on page 309, quote, describe these symptoms to a psychiatrist without informing them of the REM sleep deprivation context, and the clinician will give clear diagnoses of depression, anxiety disorders, and schizophrenia, end quote. But what's really at play is just the lack of sleep and sleep deprivation. And he points out how sleep deprivation will make even the best among us do crazy stuff, right? And so none of us are immune from the ill effects of sleep deprivation. Okay, so what are my thoughts? And I've spent a lot of time detailing what the book is about. In part because I think a lot of the stuff is so important, and I think it gives you a good taste of what reading the book would be like. But so some general thoughts. I didn't like part 4 as much. It just wasn't as gripping. I think I intimated that earlier. Not to say it wasn't good. It just wasn't as good as the first 3 parts, I would say. A lot. I liked. I didn't enjoy, I guess, kind of his forecasting of what we can do to better ourselves and society and so on. Not that it was bad or or poorly reasoned or anything like that. It wasn't as engaging, I would say. So, real quick on the accessibility while I'm thinking about it, pretty accessible. Again, he does a good job of surveying all the relevant issues and then also alluding to the relevant research, but in a very accessible way. And I would say, if you're on the fence about getting the book, you could check out the Joe Rogan podcast, in which, I guess that's a 2-hour podcast. I don't remember how long the episode is with him, but go see, at least parts of that, and that'll give you sort of a taste of what Matthew Walker's like and whether you might, dig reading one of his books. But, I thought his approach was very accessible. My attitude going in, I mean, again, life-changing book for me, right up there with Fast Food Nation. For me, these two are going to have a very special place in my heart for a long time. My attitude going in is, like I said, on par with what Dave's was. It's like non-existing. We were in our conversation. So there's 3 of us talking and mentioning how when our wives have some free time, the first thing they want to do is go take a nap. And these guys were talking about how, like, I have a more appreciation for that now, but like they're saying, like, well, there's all kinds of things I'd rather do. It's like the last thing I want to do. And again, it's like you're not existing. I had that sense, and I was totally on par. That was exactly kind of how I viewed sleep. But now, totally different. So I mentioned how. So I guess the one thing I would mention is my bedtime literally has changed since I started reading this book. So before I was 6.5 to 7 hours was average. Now I get 7 to 9 sometimes, and my bedtime went from like 1:30 to 3:30, sometimes later than that. I really was a night owl. To right when I started reading this, I kind of changed. To now, it's like I'd say 10:30 to 12:30, right in there. Usually 11 to 11:30 is really when I tend to go to bed, and that's after decades of the opposite being true, literally decades. So I mentioned how this has really been a life changer. I mean, I'm not going to get into some of it. Like, I mean, I go to bed clothed with a lot less clothing. I don't know. I probably could have said that better, but you get the idea. Because one aspect that we don't think about is our body cools when it's going to sleep, and so it's better to err on being too cold than too hot. You'll be able to fall asleep sooner. So I take that into account. Darkness. I need to have complete darkness now. I try to eliminate all light when I'm sleeping and so on. So it has been a huge game changer for me. So much so, like one thing I thought about a lot, I'd always kind of had this in the back of my mind is like, again, that idea that sleep is like not existing. So I would think like, okay, so maybe those of us who sleep longer per day or per night, they have longer life expectancy, but they're not existing for 1 hour per day, whereas I am, right? Because I'm not sleeping for that 1 extra hour. I'm existing for 1 extra hour per day. But what I did is I actually went through and did the math. So we have what I call the quantitative argument up here. Okay? And so what I did was I actually took, and this is from some website, and I didn't write it down, but the average life expectancy of a American female, which is higher than I thought, is actually 82. And so I said, so somewhere in the book, and I can't remember where I got it, I'm pretty sure he said if you sleep, 6 hours per night versus 7, so if you get one less than 7, that reduces your life expectancy by 10 years. So I did the math. So if you sleep 6 hours per night, and you're the average female woman, then you're going to live to be 72. But the former me is going to say, well, hold on, but you're not existing, right? Let's say you did sleep 7 hours per night, and you ended up being 82, right? But you weren't existing 1 hour per night for those 82 years, right? Well, I went and did the math. That's what all this is doing right here. Okay. And I actually calculated how many years that adds up to. Over 82 years, sleeping one more or not existing 1 more hour each day. That adds up to 3.42 years of not existing or, extra sleep then. So even if you subtract that from 82 then, okay, you're still better off sleeping 7 hours a night because you're still going to make it to 78 point, what is that, 5'8", so 78 and a half years old versus 72 years old if you only sleep 6 hours per night. So I literally did the math and I called that the quantitative argument. And then I also have, so this is kinds of things I think about and jot down as I was reading this book. I also provided my own qualitative argument, which is basically just compare how you feel when you have a full night's rest versus how you feel when you don't. Don't you feel qualitatively better? I mean, I really do feel that way, and I feel like I'm not as impatient, so on and so forth. So there's that qualitative sense in which your life really is qualitatively better when it feels better, right? You don't feel like a zombie throughout the day. So anyway, those are the quantitative and qualitative arguments for getting that 7th hour of sleep, that additional hour of sleep. I mentioned all that. So are you getting enough sleep? I thought he mentioned two great diagnostic questions on page 35. When he references, could you fall back asleep at 10 or 11 a.m., right? So you wake up, and at about 10 or 11, could you feel like you could take a nap? If the answer is yes, then you're probably not getting enough sleep. And, quote, can you function optimally without caffeine before noon, right? If the answer is no, then you're probably not getting enough sleep. 65, so he mentions on 296, he quotes a poll that was done, and a survey. Quote, more than 65% of the U.S. adult population fail to obtain the recommended 7 to 9 hours of sleep each night during the week, end quote. So 65% of us aren't sleeping enough. So, and that's a point that he hammers home throughout. Okay, it's to such a point that the World Health Organization has deemed lack of sleep a global health epidemic. Big deal. Unfortunately, and this is the real kicker for me, what I thought was really interesting, and kudos to Walker for bringing this up, because I think it's telling, right? He mentions, page 303, most people will trade sleep for a higher salary, and he references this survey from Cornell University, and page 304 details it, where, they gave them a choice between either $80,000 a year working normal work hours and getting the chance for around 8 hours of sleep, or, second option, $140,000 a year working consistent overtime shifts and only getting 6 hours of sleep each night. Unfortunately, the majority of individuals went with the second option of higher salary and shorter sleep. So the options were, a lower salary but more free time and more sleep, or higher salary, less free time and less sleep. And most people go with the latter, and I think that's unfortunate. I guess not too surprising though, maybe, given that 65% of us aren't getting enough sleep. Okay, so what are some issues or criticisms I had? I thought he really, he's not a philosopher, he's not a logician, but, he proceeds pretty straight, in a straightforward fashion. I don't have a lot of criticisms. There were some, places where I thought the logic could have been a little better, I guess. There's a head scratcher here, for example. I thought this is a little corny or a little weird. I say, is this a joke? So he's citing, I don't remember who did this, a study done by NASA in the 1980s, where they took pictures of the spider webs of spiders who were on various drugs. I don't know, that seemed a little odd to me to cite that as evidence of anything really, but he was talking about the demerits of caffeine at that point. Not a huge issue. So this is just one example, small example of how I thought the logic could have been better, so to speak. So he's mentioning how old is sleep? Well, every existing species we know of has slept, including so he's citing worms and the fact that they are over at least 500 million years old. And so he's saying, well, therefore sleep must be that old. But that's a fallacy. Just because worms nowadays and every species nowadays is known to sleep doesn't mean that worms 500 years ago shared that same characteristic. We know things evolved, right? So to assume then that so that is worms, so it's a quote, that is worms and sleep by association predate all vertebrate life. And so to assume then that just because worms are that old, then sleep is that old, to me that's a fallacy, I think. This happened a lot of places, but he would come at percentages, and it wasn't necessarily his fault, but he would say things like 40% of our productive time is spent doing yada yada yada, and maybe these were referenced in studies, but I've been how do you determine that? Where does this 40% come from? So there were a few times where that's well, actually, 40%, that's funny. That's exactly what this one is. So page 102, he says, quote, "But the most important lesson to be gleaned from this discovery for me was that 40% of the explanation for the loss of deep sleep in the elderly remained unaccounted for by our discovery." Like, 40%? How do you know this 60% was accounted for? Like, I guess maybe in a more thorough work, like I would like more explication in terms of, why do you suggest 60% was explained? So another sort of logical hiccup, I guess, page 204 to 205, he jumps to the conclusion, I think he does this a few times, jumps to certain conclusions based on things that don't necessarily merit it. So I actually cited this earlier. I mentioned that, quote, "Between 35 and 55% of emotional themes and concerns that participants were having while they were awake during the day powerfully and unambiguously resurfaced in the dreams that they were having at night," end quote. And so he makes this jump to this conclusion then that, quote, "dream sources are transparent." He says that on page 205, right? That we understand the architect of our dreams, more or less, right? That we have deciphered the source of our dreams, emotions, and what we, the emotional baggage we deal with in our everyday lives. But I don't think that follows simply from citing a study that says between 35 and 55% of our emotional themes and concerns that participants dealt with during that day shine through in their dreams. So what about all the other, what about everyone else for whom that wasn't the case? So again, like, seems to jump to some conclusions, but those were certainly the exceptions and not the rule, I thought. So similarly on page 234, he wonders, like, is lucid dreaming, right? Is that beneficial or detrimental? And he seems to sort of suggest, well, wouldn't Mother Nature have given it to all of us if it was beneficial? But that seems like a terrible argument because, why aren't we all super attractive then and super intelligent and so on? So little things like that I thought were an issue. And I give other examples. So he cites, for example, $2,000 per employee per year are lost in productivity when you don't get a certain kind of sleep. Like, where does that number come from? How do you know that it's $2,000 per employee? So I cite page 298, there's an example there. Page 319, another example, page 331. They're all just examples of where, like, these numbers come without really due explication, I would say. Okay, so that's it. I guess in the book musings grade, and what would I give this grade? Obviously, a great book, I think. Before I get into the specific grade, I do want to say, as a preparatory remark, I was thinking about it. In general, I mentioned in the episode 0 that I would be given like 10% A's and 20% B's, and how would I can't even imagine giving a book an F, and like most would get C's. And the more I thought about it, I'm at the point in my life where if I get a book, and especially if I read it, odds are, I've already like filtered it somewhat. I'm probably interested in it. It's probably going to appeal to me in certain ways. So the whole gist here is I want to say that I don't know that there are going to be a lot of books that I would rate super low, given that, right? That I'm going to review and that are necessarily going to get those super low grades. I am still going to try to be sort of distinguishing or discerning in the grades I give, but I guess the whole upshot is that, it makes sense that I'm going to view a lot of these books favorably, given that they're books I'm interested in and I've done some research to get them in the first place. Okay, so anyway, in general, it should be clear that I have favorable thoughts of this book. I mean, it made a huge impact on me. I'm going to give it not quite the Book Musings Hall of Fame. Didn't quite reach that, but I'm going to give it a B, a solid B, and maybe even, I debated on whether to throw in pluses or minuses. I'm going to give it a B plus because it has been that life-changing to me. It could have been more philosophical and more reflective. I thought he was at times, though, but what was it lacking? Just tiny little stuff to take it to that next level, but it was certainly super close. So kudos to Matthew Walker for a great book, a life-changing book, one that I highly recommend, and I just bought for a friend last night because I highly recommend it. Last thing I'm going to do is just briefly show you what might be on tap coming up here. I alluded to these two in my last episode, as well as the one I did for this episode. On the what's on tap portion at the end of that episode, I mentioned that these two might be coming up, and I have started on this one, so that could be coming. Also had a interest in Vonnegut lately. Come across Slaughterhouse-Five for some reason, went out in the library and got it. I don't know what got me down the path, but it sounds like it's really on, again, into similar interests of what I've been thinking about and unrelated stuff like our personal identity and what is death and so on. Apparently, those are big themes in this book. So, and I've never read a Vonnegut book, which is crazy to me. So I think this is definitely coming up soon. And then I also picked this one up recently. I'm a philosopher. I question everything, and so conspiracies have always been of interest to me. And this is written by a professor at the University of Florida, sort of um, investigating the very notion of conspiracy theories to begin with, and suggesting how the very notion of conspiracy theory was fostered by some government agencies to give those who question the government a bad rap. Interesting subject for me, so pick this one up. Might dive into that one soon too. So that might be on tap. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed Book Musings Episode 2 on Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker. Great book, not Matthew Walker or myself. I gave it a B+, very solid book. So thank you. Look forward to Episode 3.